Welcome to the Asia Society. This is Asia Society at the Movies, and today we have an exciting conversation that's exploring the work of Feng Xiaogang. And many of you will have seen some of his films. You may have seen it through our Asia Society at the Movies, or you may know his work more broadly. But we're really thrilled to have two colleagues here as part of this conversation who have a broad knowledge and I think an interesting take on what we're about to discuss. So first, I want to introduce Geremie Barmé, who is a historian, cultural critic, filmmaker, translator, web journal editor who works on Chinese cultural and intellectual history, and who is also a participant in the China File, which is part of Asia Society. And Susan Jakes is editor of China File, which I hope you will all check out. She is a senior fellow at the Asia Society's Center on U.S.-China Relations. From 2000 to 2007, she reported on China for Time magazine, and first as a reporter and then as an editor in Hong Kong, and then was in Beijing for many years and wrote for many publications. And we're really grateful to all of you for being part of our larger conversation, and for the two of you for sharing some thoughts and insights on this very interesting filmmaker. So over to you, Susie.
And I just want to start by saying how grateful I am to you for inviting me to have this conversation with Geremie, because as I was watching these films and thinking about preparing to have this conversation, I realized that Geremie Barmé is pretty much the dream Chinese movie date of all time. Exactly the person that you want to talk to after watching just about any Chinese film. As Rachel said, Geremie's a scholar of literature and culture, high, low, in between, and politics in China, and over the past roughly 5 decades. And he's a scholar of really unrivaled breadth and erudition. So you're only going to get about 45 minutes of him today, but if you're interested in reading more of his exceptionally learned, insight-soaked commentary, then I recommend the website that Rachel just mentioned, his website, which is called chinaheritage.net. And also that you take a little look at the work that he's done for Asia Society in pieces that he writes for our online magazine, China File. So Geremie, I thought before we get into a discussion of the 3 of Feng Xiaogang's films that are in this series of Asia Society at the Movies, which were selected by our colleague Li Huang in the Asia Society Southern California Center. Maybe I could ask you to just situate Feng for us in the landscape of Chinese cinema, or more broadly in kind of Chinese popular culture. Some of our audience will know his films well, and of course he's a screenwriter, he's an actor, he's a producer, incredibly prolific director. But some people will know his work less so. So maybe just start out with a bit of an introduction.
Great. Well, Susie, thank you so much for being here today and for inviting me to be involved. And Rachel, I'm very grateful for you setting up this conversation. Where to place Feng Xiaogang? He's born in the late 1950s, and he's part of an important subculture of China. And that is the culture of what is named 部队大院, which is the military enclaves, or the military compound culture that existed from the time of the founding of the People's Republic. Now, this is a very privileged and unique world, and it's one we'll discuss in a moment when we get to youth, or Fanghua. And it's a world in which he and his close collaborator, Wang Shuo, both grew up in. It's a world of the army that, as an organization, remained relatively stable throughout all of the ructions, from the 1950s right through to the end of the Mao era. The one organization that was privileged insofar as it was funded, it was fed, it was relatively stable, and it was not subject to the types of wild political extremism that rent the society more generally, although it was the origin of much of the extremism. So it's just worth remembering that there's this, he comes from this very particular world that, although in some ways it's lost some of its cachet, it gave him and his colleagues like Wang Shuo a very particular view of China and a view of their society that is that helps us understand a bit better the types of movies he's made, in particular the films we'll be discussing. He is part of this world, and I don't want to diminish his uniqueness, because I think he is truly, for all of the limitations of some of his movies, this is an extraordinarily creative and inventive individual, a man of great talent, incredible perception in reality, a person incredibly perceptive, extremely funny. It's very much a Beijing-based personality with a Beijing-based temper that is not, that, as you know, with the way that the People's Republic works, has a sort of universal valence in the Chinese world, just as Hollywood really occupies the world of American entertainment. But one of its great loci is New York, and New York is regarded in many ways as being quintessentially American in certain regards, even though it's so different from the rest of the country. Beijing is profoundly different from any other part of China, yet its culture, its language, its temper, and its attitude, we don't want the official attitude, but its attitude, the social attitude of people from the privileged groups, which Feng Xiaogang has always really belonged to the normal person, is one that has become to represent a large amount of Chinese mainstream culture itself. So he and Wang Shuo, and particularly Feng Xiaogang, they come to age really in the 1980s. This is the age, and they're in their 20s and early 30s, and Feng Xiaogang becomes involved with cultural creation, becomes a writer, screenwriter, and later director in the 1990s. And that is an era, as we know, that was extraordinary in Chinese history. It is perhaps a unique moment. Well, it's definitely a unique moment in the history of the People's Republic, one where the open door and reform policies were undoing, to a great extent, the types of social, political, and intellectual strictures that had determined life in China from 1949 onwards. And there was massive social transformation. There were moves towards a kind of political experimentation, never fulfilled, constantly frustrated, but there were moves in that direction. And there were also extraordinary changes in the publishing and entertainment industries, when the waggish temper, the naughty, wise guy, wisecracking, street smart temper of the Beijing, well, basically the military courtyard as well as the Beijing streets, became one of the central elements of Beijing mainstream culture and found a voice in the work of people like Wang Shuo, who was a novelist but also a film writer, and Feng Xiaogang. And so both of them sort of contain that spirit of the 80s. And oddly enough, even to this day, their work still has that an element of that period. And this is where things get a bit darker, in that it's the same period in which the possibility of China as a society, the People's Republic of China, to grow politically and socially in tandem with the economic reforms that had been launched from the late 1970s, was frustrated by political fiat, interference in the one-party state. And we know in particular, because of the purges first in 1987, as a result of student demonstrations, and more famously in 1989, with the crushing of student rebellion and worker rebellion in 89, the protest movement of 1989 that hit Beijing and 20-odd other cities. China has not been able as a society to grow or mature in certain ways because people do not participate politically or socially in their society in an equitable fashion. The party having frustrated that possibility, we find in Feng Xiaogang's films, even today, wonderful and interesting that though many of them are, we find a certain level of, I don't want to say immaturity, but we find the possibilities that are indicated in their earlier work to not be present. These here, Wang Shuo and their whole echelon and group of friends, their cohort, would have in other societies grown in a different way, perhaps. They've been wildly successful. Feng Xiaogang is an incredibly successful filmmaker. He makes movies that are both popular and some of the high-end elite, but also there's something lacking, because this is my very view that many Chinese friends of the mainstream will hate, my friends in China would not hate, because many of us have had these conversations for, 30 odd years now. So the films reflect something else. They reflect a temper that can be very hard to deal with if one is not entirely new and part of the Chinese cultural, political, social environment. So it's important to be aware of that. But having said that, Feng Xiaogang has been at the forefront of some of the sort of cultural changes in China. For example, Susie and I were discussing earlier, he and Wang Shuo produced a show in 1992 TV series called The Editorial Department. That is in my opinion, one of the most extraordinary productions. It's sardonic, it's layered, it's humorous, it makes fun of the party while affirming its position in the post-1989 world. It's beautifully performed. If you want to learn and listen to good Chinese and learn or hear how the Beijing style finds representation in a very amusing, it's really a set piece. It's a comedy set in an editorial department. I can recommend it to you. It's online. It's all, on YouTube. You can watch the whole thing there. But he also, Feng Xiaogang, the next year produces another series called A Beijing Man in New York, which both of these works had an impact on my own work, because I've been watching things for decades. Beijing Man in New York contains one of the paradigmatic scenes of post-1989 China, one that has continued to resonate through Chinese culture to this day, and one that, to my mind, because I used it to write a chapter about new nationalism in China, as I wrote in 1994, because the scene is the scene of a Chinese businessman in New York with a prostitute, having sex with a prostitute, and throwing dollar bills at her as he demands that she says she loves him. It's an appalling scene. It was grotesque at the time. Incredibly popular in China, incredibly popular with Chinese intellectuals who had and we talk about mainstream people, who all huge numbers of reviews which I read, because on one level it represented, we were crushed in 89, our aspirations for political and social change had been frustrated. And there was an element within the culture, as there still is in my opinion, mainstream PRC culture, of self-hatred. A self-hatred that finds expression through a kind of bombastic, aggressive, self-important, macho, and even when it's women, macho, because it's a very much a masculine defined form of identity and expression, aggressiveness. And that show just encapsulated it brilliantly. I used it as the opening scene of my essay on Chinese nationalism, which I called "To Screw Foreigners is Patriotic," which is actually a translation from a line of an interview done by a Chinese friend of mine with a Chinese prostitute around that time. And it presaged a lot of the type of aggressive world that was. So Feng Xiaogang was, not only does he reflect the temper of the times, but he's also, he not only gets it, but he gives voice to it in an extraordinary fashion. And that is something that he's done throughout his career while making some light, fluffy, popular entertainment, but also serious movies, as well as making occasionally these films that somehow capture the zeitgeist of the People's Republic, not the zeitgeist of the global community or of the broader humanity. Humanity is not necessarily a word one uses too lightly in this context, but it does capture a certain element. And therefore, apart from being entertained by his films, which I'm not always entertained by, there's also an element of the sociological, because it offers insights into a way of being and thinking in the world that in many regards, one just has to say, is different. It is particular, it deserves understanding, not always respect, but it deserves engagement. And Feng Xiaogang is one of the people who does it. At the same time, he is profoundly aware that he's built up a huge amount of street cred as well as capital, real dollars, because he's made tens of millions of dollars with his work. And he is also incredibly, in artistic terms, a decent creative personality, in that he wants to use both his social and cultural capital and his real capital to also make films that are a bit more expressive of what he'd really like to talk about. one of the films, Fanghua Youth, is one of these movies. And he's sort of like the Scorsese of China, because in the last number of years, he's been very controversial in that he's spoken out and said, if one just panders to the teenagers and the people in their early 20s by making online entertainment and movies that pander to them, then we're just producing a culture of fluff and insignificance. Now, this coming from one of China's most commercially successful fluff-generating directors. So interesting, but nonetheless, he's taken that type of stand, been much attacked for it, very criticized by the authorities and by critics more generally. But nonetheless, he's taken an interesting cultural stand. So in many ways, a cultural barometer, an incredibly creative individual, part and parcel of a world in China that on one level seems, it's horrible to say, but retrograde, because there are, just if one looks at the film, the sort of social conscience and the types of gender relations and social awareness of what, to use that overused word, but it's not a bad word, wokeness. It's really, we're talking retro. It's retro, and therefore, for those of us who live in another cultural environment, a globalized cultural environment, and China is not. It's aspirational and wants to be global, but it is not a globalized environment that engages with what Xi Jinping calls the community of shared destiny of humanity. It simply does not, because it does not recognize many of the basic ideas and values that pertain to humanity. And that is because of its party-oriented culture. And this nobbles Feng Xiaogang and limits his possibilities. Would he grow in a different way? Would he make other types of movies? We'll never know. The movies that he does make are extraordinary and important. But that's one of the things one always deals with dealing with mainland Chinese culture, is the constant hamstringing of possibility. And I think that Feng Xiaogang's limitations are not only his own personal limitations, and is incredibly, as I said, within those limitations, he's incredibly creative and admirable. But they're the limitations of the environment in which he lives.
And yet he has a group of near contemporaries in the Chinese film world. The big three, fifth generation directors, Zhang Yimou, Chen Kaige, and Tian Zhuangzhuang are all, I think, about 6 or 7 years older than he is. Jiang Wen's maybe a few years younger, and they have, to differing degrees over the period, 30 years of their active filmmaking. They have actually sort of punctured that wall that divides the Chinese mainstream experience from some sort of more, some broader humanity, and their films have enjoyed much greater international audience reception and critical reception. I wonder how you see him in relationship to those contemporaries.
Indeed, they're a little bit older, each of them, and they're all people I know, and I've known since their school days in the early 80s, and people with extraordinary ability. And some of their films I really like. Most of them I can't stand because of, I believe, all of them. Even Zhuang to an extent, who I admire the most of that group, the Chen Kaige and others. Though Jiang Wen is a different case. Jiang Wen is a different type of talent, and who I have a great affection for as an actor and as a filmmaker. But they tried. They have tried from the 80s right through to now. I believe and hope they will try again and continue trying to create films that belong to all of us. And at moments they have, and that has been one of the great pleasures of Chinese culture in the last 40 years, is their successes. One of the great heartbreaks is their failures and their compromises and their selling out. The latest example being my old friend Chen Kaige and another friend Choi Hak, Xu Ke, have just produced China's most successful recent box office hit, Choson Reservoir, about the Korean War. It is directed by, there's 3 directors, and I know 2 of them, Choi Hak and Chen Kaige. It is an appalling and monstrous propaganda movie of the huge budget and just completely creepy. But nonetheless, as you said, all of those directors you mentioned, Zhuang, Chen Kaige, Zhang Yimou, have all made works that appeal to a broader world. Why has Feng Xiaogang failed to do so? Again, does it come down to, I can't unless one sits down and looks at all of his work and considers it analytically, it's not only Beijing, but it's that temper of that city, its way of dealing with its circumstances as both a former imperial capital, but also the capital of what's now called by Chinese friends the Red Empire. And it's extremely inward-looking. It's extremely self-absorbed and also sometimes too pleased with itself. And we'll get onto the movies we're going to discuss in a moment, and I think we see that reflected in those films. There's a kind of smugness that believes itself to be too clever to be understood by outsiders. And that is one of, for all of Feng Xiaogang's great achievements, it's one of the things that I feel that hampers him compared to the other directors you've mentioned, let alone compared to some of those incredible documentary filmmakers and non-official filmmakers in China who over the last 30 years have really shown what Chinese film and culture and thought and humanity should be, could be, can be, and sometimes is. And so one must always remember there's this incredibly interesting world of documentary filmmaking and also short filmmaking in China, produced by incredibly clever and engaged people. And that has been, to see that possibility, the media changing in the way that allows that to happen, and then the censorship, for all of its own sophistication, incapable of shutting off everything, that's enabled those of us who care about China's global, well, China being part of humanity, which it is, part of the broader enterprise of being alive. That has been one of the great thrills. That Feng Xiaogang hasn't achieved that type of international success is also terribly telling. In particular, right now, that China is, in so many regards, while pressing to be much more of a global presence economically, geopolitically, and many other ways, is going to be less and less so because of what's happening under the man I long ago dubbed the chairman of everything.
Right, who has exhorted filmmakers to tell China's story to the world. So and
also to tell it in the way that we want it told, because there is a monolithic, there's a correct story, and then there's all the other stuff. And this is when, again, the tragedy from 1942, when Chairman Mao at the time gave a speech at the Yan'an Forum on Arts and Literature. And that speech, which if anybody's interested, it's online, you can go and read it. It continues to be the baseline for Chinese cultural production, even though in the 80s and 90s, nobody paid any attention to it. The country moved beyond that. But now Xi Jinping has reaffirmed the message of that speech, and it's extremely depressing for those of us of a certain era, a generation, to be witnessing this. Is it a regression? Is it retro? Is it I call it a restoration of past values? And it's going to limit things more and more. How far, we don't know, but it's fairly evident that it's going to go fairly far. One can only take some measure of hope from the fact that I lived through the end of the Cultural Revolution. We'll talk about that in a moment. And even in the Cultural Revolution, it didn't work. So there's no reason to think that the present form of stricter and control, given China's liveliness, complexity, and incredible variety, that's going to work now. I don't think it will. Well, I know it won't.
All right, well, this is a perfect setup, I think, to talk about these three films, which, of course, are not quite contemporary. They're all, well, actually, that's not true. Youth is only about 4 years old, but the two romantic comedies were released in 2008, I think, in 2010, during this period when Feng was just enormously prolific and making these gigantic, huge blockbusters, hugely ambitious or technically ambitious films. His martial arts film, The Banquet, his historical epic about the Henan famine back to 1942, and this is something else we could touch on later, is that he has actually collaborated a lot more with actors outside of China than many other Chinese directors have. Anyway, the first film we're going to talk about are this pair of films. Like many of Feng's films, they star Guo, who is in some ways the actorly embodiment of this Beijing sensibility that you were discussing so beautifully earlier. He plays this guy in his late 40s, so I guess about Feng Xiaogang's age at the time of the movie, named Qin Fen. He's a kind of a cynic, slacker, idiot savant. I mean, many of the things that you just described so beautifully. And he's a Beijinger, of course, and he strikes it rich at the beginning of the film by inventing what he calls a conflict resolution terminal, which I mean, we can talk about this in a minute, but I mean, I think it does inject a little bit of awareness of this world into the film. Which it's basically a plastic tube and two people stick their hands inside it to hide their hands so that they can't cheat when they're playing rock, paper, scissors to resolve a conflict. So it's kind of the solution to all of these profound social ills in Beijing in the form of this little plastic tube. Anyway, he sells that, he gets rich. And he's come back to China after many years living abroad and is now looking for a wife. And so he fills out a personal ad on a Chinese dating website. It produces initially this parade of comically unsuitable matches, each of which kind of embodies another defect of Chinese society, though in a very gently mocking way. And then he finally winds up across the table in a kind of luxurious Chinese coffee shop from a much younger, emotionally troubled woman played by the Taiwanese actress Shu Qi. And we were saying before we started talking, I have to admit that even as somebody who unreservedly adores romantic comedy, who loves Guo, who's always wanted more complex and better roles for Shu Qi ever since I met her 20 years ago in Hong Kong, I really struggled to enjoy this film or its sequel. I appreciated these moments where it has a kind of, engages in a kind of satire of the hollowness that is at the center of this segment of upwardly mobile Beijingers in the 2000s. But to me, both of these films just felt so incomplete and unsatisfying. But obviously a gazillion Chinese moviegoers, completely disagree with me. And so I thought maybe, Geremie, you could just go a little bit further. In some ways, you already began to talk about this, but what is it about this? What do you think this movie is about? And why do you think people responded to it with such enthusiasm? I mean, it doesn't have romance, like it's romance, but I actually read one review that describes Shu Qi and Guo's relationship as being about as flirtatious as two iguanas having a siesta. So it's not the romance, it's not the plot. What is it about this film?
They shouldn't be challenging, but audiences and those listening into this who have not seen the films or are not from the background that gives one easy access to this world might find them challenging. They're not to my taste, I must admit. I delighted in the wise guy repartee of the Wang Shuo-esque world that I first encountered in 1987 when it became popular. I wrote about it at great length. I read all of the work that was produced and the TVs and movies that were produced on the basis of it. To me, it's tired. It's a tired world. And that's why I say it's a tired world that is really run out of gas for people like me, but I don't live in that world and I can only judge it from my personal perspective, which is one limited by all those things to do with, background, gender, blah, blah, etc., which is all true. But why so popular? And this is something, you're familiar with also some of the reasons for the type of popularity of this type of film. If one thinks about you were living and reporting from China during this extraordinary moment, what we may in our own lives see as the last flourishing of reformist China. You were living there, working there, and aware of it. And even then, you dare say, would have seen the hollowness of things and the deep-seated enemy and social angst. If one digs beneath the glitziness and the incredible newly generated wealth, the new rising middle class, not to mention the billionaire class, and the rapid transformations, which seem to promise so much. And within that, there's always, I always call it, from the 90s, I call it terminal turmoil. You'll remember that the Chinese government declared that the student and worker protests of 1989 were turmoil, 动乱. But I saw in those moves, and being a student of modern Chinese history, really looking at Chinese history and studying it and being involved with Chinese historians and friends, looking at the period of the last 150 or so years, it's to do that turmoil. It comes not at all unfamiliar to those of us in other countries, whether Western or in Japan or India or wherever, and that is the collapse of traditional values, ideas, and social norms being replaced by a welter of other things. In the Chinese case, they're replaced first with the collapse of the imperial order and the Confucian world order, eventually replaced not by the democratic possibility of the Republican Revolution of 1911, which, as we don't have time, but has been realized in Taiwan, which has become a modern, democratic, market-based, constitutional, society, civil society. In the mainland, the collapse was replaced eventually by the Maoist Stalinist regime and its worldview. With its collapse, with the death of Mao, what is called the disavowal of that Maoist Stalinist tradition, nothing has really replaced it. So there's an emptiness at the heart of not only there's an emptiness at the heart of everything. I could say that's one of the great dilemmas of American or Australian society at the moment. But the emptiness at the heart of the Chinese experiment is that it's not recognized by the authorities. It's denied entirely. And that period you were there, and you've been there much longer, and you followed China for so many decades, you're completely aware of these dilemmas, that this emptiness is not even debated now on a broader level. And the Goryeo performances really, to my mind, give voice to this basic existential sense of terminal turmoil, emptiness, but through repartee, through clever one-liners and exchanges, which date back to, of course, the Wang Shuo era, because Wang Shuo is one of the co-writers of both movies. And if one understands Chinese, the films are full of clever one-liners, but they're one-liners that don't go anywhere. They're a one-man act. Well, they're actually two men, because Shuqi has great lines. She's fantastic. She's got some of the greatest rejoinders and really completely flummoxes the guy. And it's an amusing sparring. And did audiences just delight in the fact that here's a really smart, very attractive, Kui woman just playing one of these not typically, but atypically misogynistic, successful business people, and playing him for a fool until she basically gets a relationship that it suits her. And not him particularly, but then he adjusts his goggles and adjusts himself. Now, to me, it's completely unsatisfying on every level. Interesting to listen to, interesting to watch again. Lots of pretty scenery, lots of great luxury. In Chinese, it's called xuanfu, to show off one's wealth, ostentatious display of wealth, which people would have loved because it's a great thing to indulge in. To me, they're both movies, now that we see where society has gone in the last 10 years under Xi Jinping, a dullard of extraordinary scale and magnitude. Both films feel so fin de siècle, very end of era movies. So they take on a very different view. When I first saw Fei Chong Wu Rao, originally in 2008, and it was very much, a period piece with the Olympic year. But now they appear in a very different light. There's a style. It's appalling. I even feel a tinge of nostalgia for that type of sensibility that, although it still exists and is unchanged, but nonetheless, it's the world that generated those two movies is changed rather dramatically. But they're challenging films. They're fun. I don't know. I'd like to be more positive. I find the misogyny I find the baseline of the male-oriented, misogynistic heart of both films, despite the cleverness of the dialogue given to Shuqi, I find it nearly suffocating. I can't pretend. I should be, talking the films up, but sorry. But if one's interested in China and interested in a type of, male-oriented culture, which China still is. We've just seen the appalling rejection of the first Me Too case in China. I mean, my heavens! But one has to cope. Chairman Mao said that women can hold up half the sky. He said can. He didn't say do, although they do. And that, people always quote that line thinking that it means something. It means something quite different from what people interpret it to be. He uses a crucial word. They can, will, maybe, if we let them. And that this film has, anyway, sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah, there's this kind of extreme, unrelenting impotence to Goyot's character, even as he sort of shambles from, he's living a life of some amount of material comfort. He's got his group of friends, and yet he's kind of just failing over and over again in this.
But is this something that people related to and still relate to? And the sense that he's there's an element of that is the everyman or every person. The constant dogged attempt to deal with things and find very acute, the famous Chinese anti-hero created by Lu Xun 100 years ago, the man who snatches defeat from the jaws of victory. And this sense that, things, no matter how bad things are or how much of a failure I am, I will doggedly persist and act as though it's not the case. And he really is a wonderful encapsulation of that type of spirit. Goyot often plays this type of a character. In that sense, there's perhaps a huge appeal to the character, because of so many people feeling frustrated in their own lives about what they can really do, well, despite all the changes of the economic reform era and the possibilities that opened up. Nonetheless, there's just so many possibilities that exist, because people know that above there's a hidden organization that has hidden finances and control over everything you never can really see and never can really understand, because its core is invisible and remains invisible and is secret, and its behavior is also secret. And so one finds ways of justifying oneself and just getting along. And this sort of humorous, dogged personality is one that gives one confidence and faith in one's own existence. Perhaps, I'm sorry, I'm really expecting.
No, but I think that's right. I mean, I think the film sort of mirrors that dynamic, right? Even in the plot, it sort of edges into an awareness that there's something wrong, that there's something lacking. There's that great conversation about fake art I think it's in the second one, of this awareness of this void, and then it kind of edges away from it back into comfort or the kind of incoherent plot. I mean, I thought that was what made it kind of interesting to me, even though I didn't.
Indeed. Given Feng Xiaogang and Wang Shuo, they're incredibly smart, talented writers. These are incredibly perceptive. If one reads Wang Shuo's novels, the last couple of novels he wrote before he just gave up and went commercial, represented a subtlety of awareness and style that is quite breathtaking. They could have turned these films into major works of existential discussion and debate. They would be mini classics. But they're not. And so they didn't go that far. Sadly.
They hold back. Yeah. Well, maybe we should then turn to Youth, which is in many ways a more ambitious film. It's based, again, of course, on the mostly autobiographical novel by the writer Yan Geling, who's Feng Xiaogang's contemporary, and who, like the film's narrator, Suizi, and like Feng Xiaogang himself, spent her portion of her adolescence during the Cultural Revolution as a member of a military performance troupe. So the film begins just toward the end of the Cultural Revolution, and it has a coda in the 1990s, but it's mainly focused on these years of massive political and social change between Mao Zedong's death in 1976 and the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979, as refracted through the lives of these young dancers and musicians in a troupe based in southern China. So I thought maybe, Geremie, although you've done this already a little bit, but maybe start by talking a little bit about the history and significance of military performance troops in China.
First, I just say that this film covers nearly exactly the period that I was during which I was a student in China. I went to China in 1974 and lived there till 77, 78, then lived in Hong Kong till the early 80s and traveled back and forth. And this is a world that era I'm very, very familiar with. And one of the things I'd say about the film is that just if audiences are just interested in getting some sense of the feel of that era, the 74, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that era, the way it looked, the way people, in particular in the military, the way they moved, the way they spoke, the minor details of the types of cups and saucers and bedding and so on and so forth that people had, that the film is superb. I find it incredibly moving and nostalgic making, and also very sad, extremely poignant, but done with a very light touch and done in a very Chinese way. So a lot of it is done through objects, the photographic. Anyway, we'll go to that in a moment. But so the military, as I said, was this very privileged environment. In the Cultural Revolution, it was from the military was the group, the source of the impetus for the Cultural Revolution. It provided the model for some of the unobtainable, unrealistic moral excellence of revolutionary martyrs and personalities. Lei Feng, who's the great martyr, he's a martyr because he was killed by a falling electrical pole because he misdirected a truck that backed up and knocked the pole over and it killed him. But Lei Feng became the formal martyr of the People's Liberation Army. And the main character in the movie, Liu Feng, is always referred to as being our living Lei Feng. So the spirit of Lei Feng lives throughout the film, and Liu Feng throughout the film, he moves from being the ideal PLA soldier, helper, decent member of the troop, to becoming somebody who dares to express his personal, his love for a woman who happens to be a young lady who comes from a privileged army background and family. She rejects his advances because she has, we don't know what her real emotional state is, whether he's engaging, whether he is just, engaging in a Me Too abuse of her or not. He grabs her and holds on to her. She later claims that he has tried to rape her when he's interrogated, and destroys his life. And the film follows this man's ruined life. I find that extremely affecting and powerful. And this privileged young woman from a background, at one point she comments, this is the living Lei Feng, Liu Feng. Among the many things he does, he helps a friend who's getting married make two plush, they call them shafai, stuffed seats, upholstered seats. So he makes these two upholstered seats, and the young lady who he's lusting after sits in one of them and says, "Oh, I haven't sat in a plush upholstered seat like this since I was last in Shanghai, and I went to the Jinjiang Hotel," which is, at that era was completely cordoned off from any normal human being. And yes, I also sat in one at the home of a military leader that my family is friendly with. So it immediately indicating that I'm so above you, I cannot tell you. So there's that runs throughout the film, the sense of, again, one has to know the cues and know the world, but Yang Guoling and Feng Xiaogang deal with that beautifully because it's quite subtle. One just has to be paying attention. You see, there's this whole hidden world, and eventually Ding Ding goes off and she runs after a member of the troop who she discovers is the son of one of the regional military commanders. And she says, well, he is the same status as myself. Although he has had an affectionate relationship with another girl who's of not a similar status, who herself wants to show him that she loves her. And just as she does so, Ding Ding, the Carter's daughter, remarks when they're on the bus, she says, oh, yes, well, he and I have decided to get together because after all, we come from the same type of background. 门当户对, we come from the same family background. So the film has this element of what I spoke about earlier, this privileged, secretive world of the military. So there's the enclosed world of the military that is kept relatively free, only relatively free of the ructions and the disturbances of the Mao era. But within that, there's also layers upon layers of privilege and access and attitude. And the film expresses this, I think, beautifully. One just has to be paying attention to the cues, because each of the characters at the beginning, they all seem so comradely and nice, but through their actions, their treatment of the rather badly done by girl who joins them shopping, they show exactly who they really are, and they treat her with great contempt. And so we follow the unfolding of their personalities, and also the army world, as well as following the changes in China with the death of Mao and then the beginning of reforms. There's so many little moments that are poignant and very moving. One is when Liu Feng gets hold of a cassette recording it's a cassette tape of songs by Teresa Teng, Deng Lijun. And I remember smuggling in tapes by Deng Lijun in 1978, 79, 80. It's one of the prized things to take to friends in China, was to take in tapes of this rather soppy romantic music from Teresa Teng, a very famous Taiwanese-based singer, that helped change the way, it gave voice to a whole other world of sentimental possibility within the Chinese world, the mainland world, which had for 30 odd years been dominated entirely by this stentorian Maoist style staccato of singing and performing and dancing. And then there's the lilting tunes of Deng Lijun opened up a whole world of romantic possibility and softness, and the cadences were so different. And the impact of that, we see them, the young ladies and Liu Feng sitting there listening to a Deng Lijun song under a red chiffon scarf thrown over a neon light. And it was very moving, because I remember these scenes so well. And they had these little changes had a huge impact, because shortly after that, the very nature, the way that the broadcasters on TV and the radio presented the news every night began to change. They began to become more Taiwanese. And this other voice that no one had heard for decades, a softer, tender Chinese. I remember the exact moment in 1977 when I first heard on the mainland the word 漂亮, pretty. It had been completely banished from the Chinese vocabulary, because what you were was mei, guan da fang. You were aesthetically acceptable and well balanced. That was what was beautiful. 漂亮 was a decadent, bourgeois, unacceptable term. And the first time I heard it used as a normal word to describe something or somebody was 1977. So I found the film great. Sorry, I'm really being far too personal about it, rambling about these things. I think it's really a film worth watching and trying to pay attention to, because I think the characters are interesting and they do unfold over time. And they're incredibly repressed. They're incredibly, controlled. It's a tragic film. This is not fun and game. This is a very heartrending, tragic movie. And I was very moved by it, and I thought that Feng Xiaogang, again, here we have this extraordinary talent of a man. In 2017, made this amazing film, showing what type of films and what films he could make, and what possibilities lie ahead. And thinking all the time as I watched it, all the time, well, under the present dispensation, anything more complex or nuanced or will be frustrated. And in the interview that he gave to who was engaged in the conversation he was engaged with Yan Geling for the Asia Society, a few years ago, he said quite clearly, he said, how many great projects do we get that are just murdered in the stage of being, and he used the word murdered as scripts. We don't even get beyond preliminary development of the ideas. And it's just a simple throwaway line. But those of us who've dealt with China for these, well, now for me, it's nearly 50 years, the amount of possibility, the amount of things and works by people of extraordinary talent that have been thus prevented from appearing, censored, limited, cut off, destroyed, distorted, is truly extraordinary. Any industry does that type of thing, but in China, the situation is very different. Anyway, this film...
I remember I once was doing I guess I was hanging out in Zhang Yimou's office before doing an interview with him, and he was giving advice to a young filmmaker on getting his, like how much of his script he would be able to preserve. And this actually may have been done for my benefit, I'm not sure. But anyway, because I was it was right as Hero was coming out, and I didn't like Hero very much. But anyway, Zhang, he put up he said, you start a film, you start with all 10 of your fingers. He's like, and maybe if you're lucky, and he held up his little finger, you wind up with this much of what you wanted to say. And if you do, you've done all right. It does. Watching this film did make me think, what could this film look like in a different filmmaking environment? And yet there is this palpable tension between the nostalgia and the loving detail of the reconstruction of this world on the one hand, and then this very stinging, at times melodramatic critique of the emotional and moral destructiveness of the period that is being so lovingly evoked. I mean, there's just, incredible cruelty in this film, and the sense of lives just being completely destroyed, right? Of the two characters who are most sort of emotionally developed and morally developed are the ones who are the most, on the one hand, who are not able to enjoy the spoils of the economic development that comes later, and who are, who don't get to have families, who don't get married, who are crushed in certain ways, and yet, the film ends with a kind of celebration of this idea that there is some part of them that remains intact that is lost for the other characters.
Indeed, we survived and live into old age together, not married, not fulfilled, without children, without family, but
without any social status, money, nothing.
But we are. Exactly. It's very. It's Yengeling's tale, and it's extraordinarily powerful. The female character of the pair, Liu Feng, is the living Lei Feng martyr character who ends up relatively badly, but he really is an interesting character in the film. And Xiaoping, who becomes his friend, partner. Just one should mention one of the sort of little moments in the film that's so very revealing. Well, it carries throughout the film. When she joins the troupe, she's fled her family. Her mother's remarried, and the new family won't accept her. She's the daughter of a man who's been condemned as a counter-revolutionary and sent off for labor reform. We don't know exactly what he was before, what his status was. She gets to the troupe, and she borrows, or secretly steals, in fact, borrows by stealing a military uniform the first day she gets there, goes and secretly has a photograph taken of herself in the uniform, looking quite beautiful, and a standard portrait is made. And she has it made, and we only learn later that she'd had it made to send to her father in the labor camp, because he hadn't seen her since she was 6, just so that he knows what she looks like. Her fellow performers, who are all appalling, treat her with absolute contempt like a criminal. They attack her for having stolen the uniform. They, find this photograph and, are outraged and are morally superior. I had classmates just like that. Chinese classmates. I cannot tell you. This is how people, this is the Red Guard style personality that I'm so familiar with. Terrifying, unforgiving, ruthless, rude, cruel. I mean, it really is chilling to watch. I mean, really, I find it incredibly disturbing. It really brought back things I don't really want to remember at all. But then she never gets to send the photograph. Her father eventually is rehabilitated, but before he can, and is brought back from the labor farm and given his status back, but before he can enjoy any of that.
No, he dies. It's one of the other fathers. He dies.
Oh, that's right, he dies.
He dies.
The other one dies as well. They both.
I think the other one is rehabilitated, but anyway, he doesn't have a nice.
The other who's not rehabilitated. Before he dies, he writes to her. Sorry,
yeah.
He writes to her to tell her that I wanted to be in touch with you, and it's just been impossible. And she knows that he'll never see her photograph. He'll never know what she turned out to be. She'll never see him. He's frail, and he just writes to her to say, "I just want to let you know that I've always thought of you, and I miss you, and I'll never get to see you, and I'm sorry." And she then tears the photograph up, stuffs it under the floorboards of their dormitory, and it's discovered decades later, or 10, 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, by Liu Feng, who eventually pieces it back together again towards the end of the movie and hands it to her. It's an incredibly affecting sort of device. Yeah. But that's so many friends of mine, so many people I know, that's the story, that's the world they lived through. And I must say, I can't pretend it's worth watching this film, because this is now happening to other people in China today under a government that still, in its core, believes in the same types of things it believed in, not cultural revolutionary, but in that Maoist hardline approach to life, humanity, and behavior, and the individual. And so it's pretty scary to watch it now, because I also, as does Susie, we know people who are being treated like this. I think last week, the charges against Liu Zhiyong, the great civil rights activist, came out. And it's just terrifying to think that the similar types of abuses are happening right now on a vast scale. We're not talking about, just a couple of people. We're talking about lots of it. Anyway.
I think, sadly, that may be the end. We may have to end on a very bleak note. I had hoped to talk about the disaster. Actually, let's have one more minute just on the depiction of the Sino-Vietnamese War, because I just wanted to hear what you made of that. I mean, this is a war that is not very well remembered, I think, outside of China, maybe even inside China. And in the middle of this film, the characters, many of the main characters, are caught up in this in China's invasion of Vietnam in 1979, and there is this very, very long, very brutal, very technically adept. Kind of, it's like a cinematic aria in the middle of this film of this just horribly disastrous military invasion of Vietnam, which China and Vietnam both claimed victory in this war, but China clearly lost, abysmally. And I just wondered, what you made of that portion of the film, and was it daring at all for Feng to depict it in that manner, or not, or just what do you make of this piece of the film?
I know it's in the original, it's the end of the story. It's true. It's I was surprised by, as you said, the depiction of the violence and the nature of it, because it comes out, it's not an heroic depiction. It's a depiction of as it was. And China, they say they didn't invade. They were merely punishing Vietnam for, numerous incursions on Chinese territory, very similar to what the Chinese claimed just this week regarding India. And China was badly beaten. I remember very well at the time, friends who went to report on it. My friend Dai Qing was a reporter who reported on the war, and others that the Chinese, partly the aim was to force the military to modernize, to prove that human wave tactics didn't work. That Deng Xiaoping, in part, launched it on purpose to actually show the rest of the army that they were just old-fashioned and needed updating. And many of the people I later had friends who met soldiers in hospital in the south. I was living in Hong Kong, and many of the soldiers had been shot in the back because they hadn't advanced quickly enough for their military leaders. The same as in the story of the Korean War, where nationalist soldiers who just recently surrendered to the communists were sent to Korea to fight that war. Many of them weren't communist soldiers at all. The depiction, I was surprised by the depiction of the war scenes as being such an abject failure. It really comes across as being a disaster, both on the field, although they don't show battle scenes, they do show a scene of a logistical troop sending medicine and armaments and ammunition to the front line, and that's a disaster. And the disaster of the medical unit that's bombed and attacked. Powerful, very, quite gross. I did avert my gaze, I must admit. I don't like, I don't want those seeds in my head, but powerful. And I think it was something. He must have, he must have made a decision that I really want to show this, and he got away with it. I believe that there were scenes cut from it in China. There were various parts of the military episode were cut in China. I'm not too sure, but yeah, I thought that was impressive, interesting. A major incident at the time, now, as you say, nearly completely forgotten. Extraordinary.
Well, maybe I will just circle back to one question I started with, and we can end there. But I mean, I wonder, in some ways, it's really artificial to talk about these the two earlier films and this film in the same breath, because they were just kind of arbitrarily combined in this film series. But at the same time, there are a series of themes that really do run through them. I jotted down a few that struck me, and maybe you have some of your own, and we can sort of end by talking about those. But there's this sort of fascination with loneliness and meanings of friendship. Cruelty is in both of them. Damaged families and kind of blighted family life. Sincerity, trust, honesty, and the forces that attack them. And then these sort of questions about, human virtue and how to be a good person living a good life, which sort of comes up a little bit at the end of the second one of the If You Are the One films. So I don't know, but up to you. But I thought maybe if you wanted to touch on any of those and how you see those running through Feng's films more generally.
Well, no, they're all issues they're all themes that he deals with and engages with. He often does it using the most powerful tool available to any Chinese creator, and that is the tool of language, because the Chinese language is a subtle and complex creature of incredible refinement, and he is a great master of summing up these feelings and sentiments, often in a way that are not immediately obvious just on the screen in terms of if one's just looking at performances or at the actual the mise en scène that one encounters, but often just with the offhand comment on the one line or a certain aperçu that comes out. If one understands Chinese, he's truly masterful at that. Could be much more. His mastery could be much better used in a slightly different environment. But still, it does. He does give expression to those things brilliantly. It is. He reflects a society. Well, all of our societies are damaged and weird and confused, and whether it's a result of politics, culture, economics, or whatever. But China is a society, sadly, and one feels, Feng Xiaogang in these three films, in his other films, bumping up against the limitations, and they're not just crude political controls or censorship. It's just the limitations, again, as we all discussed, of possibility. How far can I go as a creative mind with these incredibly talented actors and actresses? Some of the Fanghua actors and actors are all newbies. They're all just this is their first screen roles. Or the more practiced artists like Shu Qi and Ge You. How far could they go if there was possibility? What's possible? I remember in 2008, I was invited to a conference on art and culture in Shanghai. And the title of, I went because a friend organized it at a large art center. And the title was just What's Possible. And I gave a paper and I said, I feel very guilty, but I have to say, nobody in this room who lives, works in the People's Republic knows what's possible because it's not possible. I gave a long paper. It's a terrible thing to say, but I said, this is the sad case. And I'm waiting. I'd love to see a China like I see in Taiwan or back then in Hong Kong, where the possible was possible. And when one watches Ge You's movies and these investigations of social enemy, conflict, sorrow, limitations, broken families, and the rest of it, one doesn't know how much more there could be. One knows that with these great talents, there would be much more. And I guess one has to sort of be grateful for what one gets.
I think Rachel's back to yank us off stage.
Oh, it's painful because I feel like this conversation really is what the Asia Society is all about, which is how can we gain insight and new readings from that mix of culture and policy and the world we're living in. And this really exemplified it. I just thank you both so much for sharing some of these ideas and insights. And I wish that this was only intermission, but I fear this is actually the end of this particular conversation, which I know will continue. But I think it does, again, reinforce that how you can read film is what the Asia Society is really all about. It's not just seeing the movies, but it's a reading of the culture we live in. So I thank you both so much. I hope that you, our audience, will join us again for Asia Society at the Movies, and also an upcoming program that China File and the U.S. China Center is going to be hosting on the 13th. Please look that up in your web announcement of our amazing programs. And again, thank you all for being here tonight.